Ford back in the 90s made some pretty good cars. However, like every other manufacturer, there were some bad ones. Now, I need everyone to understand that I don't prefer one brand over another. I like Ford, I like GM, and I like Chrysler, at least during this time period. These videos will always be controversial. Everyone is going to have their own opinion, which is totally fine and understandable. I am no expert in the slightest, I just really like cars, and after spending a good amount of time researching, I came up with a list. To be honest, this wasn't exactly easy to make. Ford had some reputable and great selling cars during this time. I wasn't able to find any Lincolns to be featured on this list, and 2 of the cars aren't technically Fords, but for the purpose of this video, they will be included. Now before I get on with the first entry, there were a couple that could have made this list, but I wasn't 100% sure. The first being the Ford Probe. They sold pretty well, the styling was advanced for the time, and reliability wasn't horrible. Next is the Mustang with the V6. Are they slow? Yeah, but they aren't certainly the worst from the 90s. The final generation Mercury Cougar could also be mentioned, but those were introduced in 99, and I recently made an entire video dedicated to it. And lastly, the Bronco 2, but those were discontinued in 1990, and I featured it in my 80s video. Alright, with all that said, let's get on with the worst 90s cars from Ford. We begin with the third and final generation Mercury Capri that ran from 1991 until 1994. The Capri name was on a hiatus for a few years with the discontinuation of the Fox body-based Capri in 1986. 5 years later, the name was back, and it is completely different from what it once was. Mercury after 1980 just had more, I guess you could say, upscale, rebadged versions of the Fords at the time. There are a few exceptions, and the Capri is one of them. The Capri was now a two-door roadster that was produced by Ford of Australia, making it a captive import. There were a few changes made to the Capri for the North American market, such as adding new gauges, airbags, and body-colored bumpers. In 1990, the Miata came out, and they were a huge hit, and with the success of the Miata, Ford wanted to dip into that market. This was during a time when Mazda and Ford were really close. Of course, the Probe was an MX-6, there were those Mazda Rangers, the Mercury Tracer, and a few more. With that being said, the Capri had the same drivetrain as a Mazda 323 hatchback. This would turn out to be one of its flaws because the drivetrain was front-wheel drive while the Miata was rear-wheel. In a vast majority of scenarios, the Miata handled so much better than the Capri. Under the hood was that same 1.6 liter used in the Miata, which made around 100 horsepower. However, if you got the XR2 trim, then you got a turbocharger added to that 1.6, boosting power to 132. XR2s were only mated into a 5-speed manual, while base models had the option for a 4-speed auto. So the Capri did feature a 2+2 seating configuration, the Miata did not. Is this a positive thing? I mean, insurance was cheaper, but there's practically no room back there. It's almost pointless. The trunk space was larger as well, and yeah, there were back seats, just if those were your needs as a consumer, you would be better off with anything else. The Mercury Capri was not safe at all. Getting in an accident in these was scary. The soft top was poorly designed and built, it would leak, the latches would break, and it would deteriorate over time. The cabin noise levels were high with or without the top, but the main flaw with the Capri was the fact that there were so many other options on the market. Of course, there was the Miata, the Lotus Elan M100, the MR2, hell, even a Storm GSI. Shortly, I'm going to play a 1-minute commercial showcasing the Capri, and it is by far one of the most bizarre commercials I've ever seen for a car.
So I invite this girl to lunch to break up with her. She orders a real expensive hors d'oeuvre and a lobster tail. I say the hard words over dessert. She touches the side of her mouth with her napkin. Stands up and walks out to the parking lot. I see her get into a brand new red convertible. Bang her fist once on the steering wheel and then drive off. Laughing, if you can believe that.
Words can't even describe the feeling for that commercial, it's just so random. I really don't understand what they were thinking, it's as if they didn't want people to buy the thing. 1994, the last year for the Capri, it would see a refresh, and while it does look somewhat better, it was already too late to save this car. The reputation was already in the toilet. The next entry goes to the 2-liter SPI engine that was introduced in 1997 and was in the Escort, Focus, and Tracer. SPI stands for split port induction. This just means the intake path to each intake valve is split into primary and secondary passages. The goal was to provide a powerful, you could say, but also a fuel-efficient engine. Power numbers were up 20% from the 1.9 liter that was previously found in the Escort and Tracer, so these motors made 110 horsepower and 125 pound-feet of torque. Here's the thing, these engines were known to drop valves, and that can cause some serious damage. When the valve seat drops out of the cylinder head, it falls into the cylinder and damages the cylinder wall, piston, and cylinder head. This can happen with absolutely no warning at all. It can also happen to an engine that has been well maintained its whole life. Typical life for this engine is about 100,000 miles, but failure can happen as early as 70,000. Now, that is not to say that these engines can get upwards of 200,000 miles, because they can, but not often. As I said earlier, the Escort, Tracer, and Focus all share this engine, but for the Tracer, this was the only engine available. The Escort and Focus had the 2-liter Z-Tech version that was double overhead versus single as an option. Let's briefly go over the Tracer because having this engine wasn't the only drawback. The 3rd-gen Tracer was only around from 97 until 99, whereas the equivalent Escort was around until 2002. When it comes to sales, the Tracer just could never keep up with the Escort, and that's totally understandable, but the margins were bad. The Escort was nearly at 300,000 sales for 97 and 98, and the Tracer couldn't hit 50,000. They just weren't popular, especially the wagon version. These cars were economical for people, they were cheap, and fuel efficient. That of itself is very important. So if you've ever owned one of these, just know that I'm not judging you in any way. The Ford Festiva, introduced back in 1988, was a very respected car. It was built by Kia, but the design and powertrain were from Mazda. These fit the definition of an Econobox, with the manual transmission expected to get well over 40 miles per gallon on the highway. And that's back in the late 80s to early 90s, it's quite impressive. Personally, I would take one of these over those Pontiac Daewoo Le Mans things any day of the week. These were super reliable, believe it or not, and if something were to go wrong, parts were super cheap. To this day, the people that still own them will vouch for it. With every car on the market, eventually sales will drop, and so the Festiva was replaced by our next entry. The Ford Aspire, which was in production from 1994 until 1997. If you completely forgot these existed, well, I'm in the same boat as you, they were very forgettable. I don't even remember the last time I saw one, it's been 5 to 10 years. Upon the Aspire's release, it completely ditched the body styling of the beloved Festiva. It was longer, wider, and rounder. It almost looked like it was modeled after the Windstar, which was a minivan. These were also based on a Mazda platform and produced by Kia. Under the hood was a 1.3-liter 4-cylinder good for 63 horsepower, made it into either the standard 5-speed manual or optional 3-speed auto. Let me be very clear when I say this. The 3-speed auto was, first of all, underwhelming, and it was scary slow. 0 to 60 in 13.8 seconds, and it would take an additional 6 more seconds to reach 70. Performance is the last thing that this car tried to be. That wasn't its purpose at all, unless you got the SE package, which came with a spoiler and fog lights. The 5-speed manual was not only quicker, but also the fuel economy was better. However, and this is one of the main drawbacks, quite frankly the Achilles heel for this car, the fuel economy was not super impressive. The Aspire was 500 pounds heavier than the Festiva, and with that said, the EPA rated the automatic at 25 city and 31 highway. The Escort at the time had very similar ratings, and you got a whole lot more car. These Aspires competed mainly with the Geo Metro and Hyundai Excel. In my opinion, I would take the Metro over the Aspire. The fuel economy was better, and it also had a cheaper base MSRP at around $78 versus $8,500 back in '94. The Ford Aspire really didn't aspire to be anything outstanding, and it is one of the most forgotten cars from the 90s. The Ford Aerostar, introduced in 1986, was a huge hit. Minivans were the new, and station wagons were being phased out. It was the first minivan to be powered exclusively by V6 engines and to have an optional all-wheel drive system.
While it's not unusual to find a four-wheel drive vehicle in an environment like this, You may be surprised to find an environment like this in a four-wheel drive vehicle. Ford Aerostar four-wheel drive with standard rear anti-lock brakes and a powerful 4-liter V6 engine. It handles the road as easily as it handles Mother Nature.
From a 2024 perspective, they do look odd. They kind of share that same sloping front design as the Previa, which is another unique looking van. GM had the Astro and Safari, while Chrysler had the Caravan and Voyager. And even though Ford sold over 2 million units, Chrysler outperformed them. Replacing the Aerostar was the all-new Windstar that shared its underpinnings with the Taurus. It adopted the front-wheel drive configuration seen on the popular Chrysler vans. These came out in 1995, right before Chrysler released their third-gen minivans. GM still had their dustbuster vans until '97. So Ford was the first, at least in the domestic market, to have a relevant van for the public. With that said, they sold well. Now, Chrysler released their updated vans less than a year later after the Windstar. Those vans featured a driver's sliding door, or at least it was an option. This would prove to kick Ford in the butt because the Windstar did not have that. To be fair, this wasn't a popular design prior, so the design team didn't think to add it. However, when it comes to sales, this does not matter. What I'm saying is that the timing was not in Ford's favor. Even though they were the first of the three to have a new van, Chrysler kicked their butt, and GM would release their new vans in '97. On top of this, these vans just looked a little outdated, both on the inside and out. These vans either had the 3-liter Vulcan V6 or the 3.8 Essex V6. Now the Vulcan is a decent motor, and so is the Essex. However, the Windstar used a cast iron block with aluminum heads. What this means is that it was prone to overheating and head gasket failure. The Essex V6 was also in the Taurus and Sable, but the Windstar weighed an additional 700 pounds. This wasn't all that good for the engine, and the suspension also suffered as the tie rods and front springs couldn't really handle all the weight as well. Like the Aspire, when was the last time you saw a first generation Windstar? They are practically non-existent, but I still see those Caravans